Corinne Applewhite is one sentence from handing a billionaire the truth that has sat 3 feet from him for 4 years when a dispatch call rips through the loading bay and takes it straight out of her mouth.
Fine. You want to understand it? Then understand this.
The radio wins. Cart abandoned mid-turn, badge swinging against her chest. She is through the stairwell door before Emmett Threadgill can even ask what just happened. The one sentence that would have rewritten both of their lives left unfinished on the floor between them. He came here chasing a resemblance. What is actually standing across from him does not have a name yet, and it won't. Not for a good while longer. Subscribe right now. Tell me where you are listening from. The countdown to this moment started 4 days earlier. Over $49 at a register neither of them will forget. A water bottle stopped halfway to the conveyor belt and never made it the rest of the way. The man holding it was third in line, cap pulled low, jacket zipper broken, and never fixed. His eyes had skipped past the cashier, past the register screen counting down in small, humiliating steps, as the woman ahead of him fed items back into her cart one at a time, past the line behind her shifting its weight, the way strangers do when a stranger's dignity is taking too long. What stopped him was a folded gray shawl still sitting untouched in her cart, the one thing she hadn't sacrificed yet. He'd seen that exact cable pattern once before, 4 winters ago, draped over a dying man's shoulders in a room he only ever entered after visiting hours ended, through a side door, so no one would know a Threadgill was standing in it. He had never said that room out loud to another person, not even his sister. Nobody in that line had any reason to know the man. Third in line ran an empire he'd spent 20 years keeping his own face off of. Ahead of him, Corinne Applewhite set the barrier cream back on the belt. 61 years old, night shift janitor, steady hands. The cashier, Devante, his name tag said, rang the total again, like the machine might have made a mistake the first time. $61.19. She had $48 and change. If you've ever watched someone do math they shouldn't have to do alone in front of strangers, hit subscribe right now, because the man watching her is about to make sure this line remembers her name for the wrong reason, or the right one. The compression socks went back next. $49.80. $4 short, nothing left soft enough to give up. Behind Corinne, a woman with a toddler on her hip sighed loud enough to carry over the register beeps, the specific performance people use when they want a stranger to feel judged without having to say so. A man in hospital scrubs checked his phone twice in 10 seconds, the second time angling it just enough that Corinne would catch the motion, would understand her slowness was costing him something he considered more valuable than her dignity. Nobody offered to spot her the $4. 8 people, 1 register, and dignity was apparently something you solved alone. The scrubs man exhaled through his nose, the kind of sound meant to travel exactly as far as the person it was aimed at. Corinne didn't turn around. She'd learned that too, somewhere along the way, that turning around only gave an audience the reaction it was fishing for. "Ma'am, I can cover the difference." Emmett heard himself say it, before the part of his brain that ran $900 million a year finished deciding if it was wise. Corinne turned. She'd heard offers like this before, and none of them had come free. "I don't need charity." No shake in her voice. "I know what I can afford." "It's not charity." He nodded at the shawl, and the question came out before he could stop it. "That pattern. Where'd you get it?" Something shifted behind her eyes. A door checked locked before answering something she hadn't expected to be asked. Devante glanced up from the register, sensing something in the air that had nothing to do with money anymore. "I make those," Corinne finally said. "Tuesday evenings. 11 years now. Maple Ridge Hospice, off Airport Highway." She said it the way a person recites a fact they've said 1,000 times, with no idea it had just detonated something behind the stranger's eyes. Emmett's chest went tight in a way it hadn't in 4 years. Maple Ridge was where his father died on a Thursday in February, that exact shawl across his lap, and a visitor log at the front desk Emmett had never once signed his real name into. 11 years on Tuesday evenings put her close enough to have known Silas Threadgill by name, close enough to have been one of maybe 6 people alive who'd seen him in his final, unguarded weeks. And Emmett had spent 4 years believing that grief belonged to him alone. He paid the difference before she could argue, sliding a plain Navy card across the reader without another word, his mind already 3 questions ahead of the receipt printing. Corinne gave a nod that clearly cost her something, and pushed her cart toward the doors. And the certainty landed in him the way certainty lands when there's no more room to argue with it. He wasn't letting her walk out of that parking lot without finding out how much she knew, and how much of his own 4 years of silence he was about to owe her the truth for. He pocketed the receipt and followed, close enough to keep her in sight, far enough that she wouldn't notice yet. Corinne pushed her cart across the lot without looking back, and Emmett kept 3 rows of cars between them, close enough to track her, far enough to still call this an accident if she turned around. The lot was half empty this late, sodium lights buzzing overhead in a color that made everyone under them look a little sick, shopping carts abandoned at odd angles between the rows like something had scattered the people who'd left them. The half of him that closed 9-figure deals for a living was already listing reasons to stop. His feet weren't listening to any of them. The cold hit different out here than it had under the fluorescent lights, and it dragged him back 4 years without warning. Not a memory he reached for, one that reached for him. A side door at Maple Ridge, propped open by a nurse named Priscilla, who never once asked why a man in an unmarked car only ever visited his dying father after 10 p.m. Emmett had thanked her for that door 100 times, without ever once asking her to unlock the front one instead. He'd told himself it was privacy. Standing in a parking lot on Reynolds Road, watching a stranger who might have known his father's name, he wasn't sure privacy had ever been the real reason. Threadgill Continuum Health ran senior care partnerships across 6 states, Maple Ridge among them, and Emmett had signed that contract himself 3 years ago, without once mentioning to anyone in the room that his own father had died in one of the facilities on the list. Nobody at the company knew. He'd built that distance himself, brick by brick, and was starting to understand it wasn't nostalgia. It was a debt he'd been avoiding paying. Corinne reached a Toyota Corolla with an inspection sticker, 2 months expired, and started loading bags into the trunk. And that was when Emmett noticed her hands. Steady, not the shake he'd expect from a woman who'd just emptied her purse over a conveyor belt in front of 8 strangers. Steady, in a specific, practiced way. The way a hospice nurse's hands go steady after enough nights of adjusting an IV line that flinching stopped helping anyone. He'd watched hands do that exact thing once before, in a room he'd only ever entered after visiting hours. If you've ever carried a secret so long your body stopped reacting to it, subscribe now, because someone in this story is about to notice hers. He closed the distance before she shut the trunk, reading the volunteer badge still clipped to her jacket, and stood there a second longer than he meant to. The specific hesitation of a man who has never in his life had trouble saying what he wants, and has no practice at all saying what he actually means. Ms. Applewhite. The name felt strange in his mouth, too formal for a parking lot, exactly formal enough for what he was about to ask. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Corinne's hand paused on the trunk lid, not quite closing it. Those supplies you put back, Emmett said. The barrier cream, the socks. Who are they for? The question landed wrong, too direct for a stranger who'd known her 10 minutes, and he watched her register that before she registered anything else. The specific offense of a man who'd already paid her total believing that gave him a receipt for the rest of her life too. He almost took it back. He didn't. Corinne's jaw tightened. The same guarded stillness from the register, except sharper now, closer to the bone. She said nothing, just looked at him, the way a woman looks at someone standing on ground he hasn't earned the right to stand on, and the silence stretched long enough that a car alarm chirped somewhere behind them, and neither of them turned toward it. Emmett understood, watching her not answer, that he'd already stepped somewhere she hadn't invited him, and that whatever she said next, if she said anything at all, was going to cost her more than the $4 he'd covered at the register. She still hadn't closed the trunk. The car alarm behind them finally stopped, and into that new quiet Corinne said, "You don't know what you're asking." "Then tell me." Emmett kept his voice low, the way you'd talk someone down from a ledge without naming the ledge. I'm not trying to corner you in a parking lot. I just need to know who those supplies are for. Corinne studied him a long moment, the kind of look that weighs a stranger's face for the specific flavor of danger he might turn out to be. And something in whatever she found there loosened her just enough. There was a man at Maple Ridge, she said. 4 winters back, Thursday nights were mine on that wing, and his room was the last one before the nurse's station. Her hand finally left the trunk lid. He never had visitors during the day, only ever late, after everyone else had gone home, like he didn't want to be seen needing anybody. Emmett's pulse did something he couldn't name. What was he like? Proud. Too proud for his own good, some nights. A ghost of something almost like fondness crossed her face. Wouldn't let me fix his blanket without an argument first. Called me stubborn. I told him he taught me the word. She paused, and the pause did more work than the sentence around it. He asked me once why I kept showing up on my day off. I told him some people just weren't built to let a person go through something like that with nobody in the room. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, and Emmett understood, with a clarity that felt less like realization and more like something breaking loose inside his chest, that he wasn't standing across from a woman who happened to volunteer at the same hospice his father died in. He was standing across from the last person on earth his father had let see him afraid. He didn't tell her. The name sat right behind his teeth, ready, and he swallowed it back down instead. 4 years of walking through a side door so nobody could ask him a single question about grief, and now that the answer to the biggest one of his life was standing 3 feet away in a Target parking lot, some old instinct in him reached for the door again. That's not something I hand out in a parking lot to a man I met 10 minutes ago, Corinne said instead, before he could ask again, and something in her tone dared him to push further. I don't need a debit card standing between me and whatever this is. That's not why I'm here. Everybody's here for a reason they don't say out loud. She said it flat, not cruel, just tired in a way that had clearly been earned over a long stretch of people offering things she hadn't asked for. My daughter doesn't know yet. That's not an accident. Emmett thought of the shawl still folded in her cart, of a man who wouldn't let anyone touch his blanket without an argument first, and said the only true thing he had. I know a man who used to do exactly that. Fight about a blanket like it mattered more than anything else in the room. He watched that land somewhere in her. Not pity, just recognition, passed between 2 people who'd learned the same language from different rooms. I don't walk away from things I understand anymore. Used to, not anymore. Corinne didn't answer that directly, but her shoulders dropped half an inch. The smallest surrender a proud woman allows herself in a parking lot with a stranger. She reached for her keys. Emmett watched her do it, and made a decision the calculating part of him would have called reckless, and the part that had spent 4 years hiding behind a side door called long overdue. He was not getting in his car and driving home tonight pretending he hadn't just found the one person alive who might be able to tell him whether his father died believing he was loved, or believing he'd been left behind by a son too much of a coward to walk through a front door. Whatever it cost him to find out, he was going to ask her the rest of it. Just not tonight, and not in a parking lot where either of them could still pretend this was nothing. Corinne's keys were already in her hand, but she hadn't opened the door yet, and Emmett understood that stall for what it was. A woman deciding how much further she was willing to let a stranger stand this close to something she'd spent years keeping locked. I run partner clinics through Maple Ridge, he said, careful now, choosing each word the way you'd cross ice you weren't sure would hold. Real ones. Specialists who don't have 6-month wait lists. If you needed to get in front of someone faster than the system usually allows, I could make a call tonight. I've been in front of plenty of someone's. Corinne's voice hardened at the edges, a door swinging shut a half inch. I know what a call from a rich man buys. It buys me a folder full of paperwork and a bill 6 months later that has my name on it and nobody else's. That's not how this would work. That's how it always works. She said it without heat, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. You people don't pay for things. You loan them. Then you wait for the moment it's convenient to collect. Emmett let that sit a second, because arguing it would only prove her right about something. I'm not asking you to trust me, he said instead. I'm asking you to let me be useful for one night, and you can decide what I am after that. Something in her face flickered. Not agreement, just a small give in the wall she'd been holding since the checkout line. I've got a daughter in Sylvania, Corinne said, her voice dropping quieter, less armored than he'd heard from her yet. 2 babies. A mortgage she's stretched thin on already. She helped me through a hip surgery 2 years back and it damn near broke her, and I am not doing that to her again. She looked at him hard. So whatever you're offering, it doesn't touch her. She doesn't find out about any of this from you or anybody connected to you. That's not negotiable. If you've ever protected someone you love by carrying a weight alone instead of handing them half of it, subscribe now. Because this is the exact moment that kind of silence starts costing more than it saves. Understood, Emmett said, and meant it more than she probably expected him to. He watched her hands while she said it. Steady, still, the same unnatural calm they'd held at the register, and the contradiction needled at him again. A woman $4 short at checkout should have trembling hands, a voice that cracked somewhere in a sentence this heavy. Corinne's didn't. Her math had been exact, down to the cent before Devante finished ringing it twice, and her refusal had come preloaded, rehearsed, like she'd delivered some version of this same speech to someone else already, more than once, long before tonight. How long have you been managing this alone? He asked, before he could decide whether it was his place to. Corinne's jaw worked once, like she was deciding how much of the truth a stranger in a parking lot had earned. Long enough to have a system, she said. One where my daughter's not the one standing somewhere doing math she can't afford when it happens. The way I was tonight. Emmett heard it and didn't move. When it happens. Not if. Corinne didn't seem to notice what she'd let slip, turning toward her door like the sentence had cost her nothing. Emmett filed it somewhere he couldn't unfile it from, a detail that didn't belong in the story she'd been telling him. A crack of light under a door he hadn't been given permission to open yet. Get home safe, Miss Applewhite, he said, because it was the only sentence he trusted himself to say out loud. She nodded once, got in, and pulled out of the lot without looking back, tail lights shrinking down Reynolds Road, until they turned and were gone. Emmett stood by his own car a long time after that, turning one sentence over and over in his head, refusing to let himself finish the thought it was pointing toward, even though some cold, certain part of him already had. 2 nights later, Emmett stood in the loading bay of the Vantage Tower at 11:40, holding a coffee he hadn't asked for and didn't want, telling himself the call to his assistant that afternoon had been about due diligence and nothing else. It had taken her 10 minutes to run Corinne Applewhite's name against the janitorial contractor his own company used for building services and come back with an address of employment. Tuesday and Thursday nights, Vantage Tower, floors 9 through 12. The bay smelled like diesel and cold concrete. Loading doors chained half open to the November air. A single fluorescent tube overhead, buzzing on and off like it hadn't decided whether it wanted to work tonight. She came off the freight elevator at 11:42, cart of cleaning supplies rattling ahead of her, and stopped hard enough that a bottle of glass cleaner nearly tipped off the top shelf. You following me now? I asked someone where you worked. That's different from following you. Feels the same from where I'm standing. She caught the bottle before it fell, set it straight, and didn't look at him again while she did it. Say what you came to say. When it happens. Emmett watched her hands go still on the cart handle. You said that Tuesday. Not if. When. Corinne's jaw did the thing it had done in the parking lot, the specific tightening of a woman deciding how much a stranger was owed. People say things at the end of a long day. Not people like you. You don't waste words. I've watched you do it twice now. Every sentence you give me is exact, like you're rationing them. He set the coffee down on a shelf he had no right to use. So when you tell me your daughter won't be standing somewhere doing math she can't afford, I don't think that's a worry. I think that's a plan, and I think you've already started making it. You don't know anything about my plans. Then tell me I'm wrong. He kept his voice level, the tone he used in boardrooms, when the only way through was refusing to flinch first. Tell me there's no plan, that when it happens was just a bad choice of words, and I'll get in my car and I won't come back to this building. The freight elevator dinged somewhere behind her, doors opening on an empty car, closing again with no one inside. Neither of them looked at it. Somewhere above them, a floor buffer droned to a stop, and the sudden quiet made the loading bay feel smaller than it had a second earlier, the kind of quiet that asks a question all on its own. "You want to know what's in my cart at Target," Corrine said, low. "You should have asked that the first time, instead of paying for it and following me out the door like a man chasing a feeling he couldn't name. I'm asking now. You're asking because a shawl cracked something open in you, and now you can't leave it alone." Her voice didn't rise, but something under it did, some pressure finally reaching the surface after 2 nights of holding it down. "You think you found a ghost in a checkout line. What you found is a woman managing something you have no business managing for her. Then let me understand it instead." Corrine's hand tightened on the cart handle until her knuckles went pale, the first crack in the steadiness he'd been watching for since the register. For a long moment, the loading bay held nothing but the hum of the freight elevator's motor resetting itself and the distant clatter of a floor buffer 3 levels up, and Emmett understood, watching her face fight itself, that whatever she said next was going to be the truth, not the version she'd been handing strangers to make them leave her alone. "Fine," she said, and something in the word sounded like surrender and refusal in the same breath. "You want to understand it. Then understand this." A radio crackled on her belt, her supervisor's voice cutting flat through the loading bay, summoning every janitor on shift to the east stairwell with a second, sharper call that carried the specific urgency of an emergency, and Corrine's whole body changed before the sentence finished. She was already moving before Emmett could ask what was wrong. Cart abandoned, badge swinging against her chest, disappearing through the stairwell door before he'd taken a single step to follow. It was a burst pipe on 11, not an emergency that belonged to Corrine at all, and 20 minutes later, she came back down the stairwell with her sleeves soaked to the elbow and her breath coming shorter than a burst pipe should have earned. She leaned against the loading bay wall, like it had been put there for exactly this purpose, and Emmett watched her chest work harder than the job justified. "You didn't have to wait." "I know." He didn't move closer. Something told him closer wasn't what this moment wanted. "You were about to tell me something before the radio went off." Corrine closed her eyes, and for a second, the version of her that ran a checkout line and a parking lot and this entire building without ever cracking seemed to set itself down, just for a second, like a bag she'd been carrying too long. "Kidneys," she said. "Stage 4, since March." The words landed flat, practiced, the way a person speaks a sentence they've already said to themselves 100 nights in a row until it stopped costing anything new to say out loud. "Dialysis 3 mornings a week before my shift starts," she went on, not looking at him, looking instead at some fixed point on the far wall, like it was easier to confess to a wall than a person. "I clean 4 floors a night on top of that. Nobody here knows my exhaustion isn't the ordinary kind. My daughter thinks I've got a cold that won't quit. If you've ever carried something this heavy without letting a single person help you set it down, subscribe now, because what he does in the next 60 seconds is going to decide whether she keeps carrying it alone." "She doesn't know," Emmett said, not a question. "She's got 2 babies and a mortgage in Sylvania, and she already gave everything she had, helping me through a hip surgery 2 years ago. I watched what that cost her. I am not doing it to her twice." Corrine finally looked at him, and there was nothing rehearsed left in her face, only the exhaustion underneath the performance she'd been running since the register. "So I've been buying my own supplies a little at a time, so that when it happens, she won't be standing in some store doing math on the day she's already burying her mother." Emmett stood in a loading bay that smelled like bleach and standing water, and felt the ground shift under a story he hadn't seen coming from any direction he'd been watching. He'd followed a stranger out of a checkout line, believing she was an echo of the people who'd sat with his father in his last season, someone who could hand him back a piece of a man he'd lost. He hadn't expected to learn she was standing at the front edge of that same season herself, alone, stockpiling her own ending the exact way his father had stockpiled his, refusing help until refusing it very nearly worked. His grief, and Maple Ridge's grief, carried separately for 4 years, folded into a single hallway with no door out of it. "You're not doing this by yourself," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Not the treatment, not the daughter conversation, none of it." Corrine didn't answer that. She pushed off the wall, gathered her cart, and finished the rest of her shift in a silence Emmett didn't try to break, walking 2 floors behind her, with nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like a rich man's reflex to fix what money hadn't caused. At 1:15 she walked him out to the employee lot, badge still clipped to her collar, and loaded her bag into the back of the Corolla with the expired sticker. Emmett reached for the trunk to help her close it. She shut it herself, first, the same small refusal she'd used the night they met, and it told him everything her diagnosis hadn't, that whatever came next between them, it wasn't going to start with her needing him to catch her. Corrine had one hand on her car door before Emmett found his voice again, and he made himself say it plainly this time. "No ice to cross, no careful footing. I can have a nephrology team looking at your chart by tomorrow morning. Not a wait list. Not a form that sits on someone's desk for 6 weeks. I can cover whatever your insurance won't, and your daughter never has to choose between rent and keeping you alive." He heard how it sounded before she could tell him. Too fast, too total. A rich man's reflex to fix with money what money hadn't caused in the first place. He slowed himself down, made himself finish the thought honestly. "But that's not why I'm asking. 4 years ago, a woman who knits shawls like the one in your cart may have sat with my father while I was too much of a coward to sign my own name at the entrance. I don't know for certain it was you. I know I'm not walking away from you the way I walked away from him." Corrine didn't answer right away. She stood with her hand still on the door, weighing him the way she'd weighed him at the register, at the trunk, in the loading bay, every time he'd offered her something she hadn't asked for. "I'm not going to say yes to you in a parking lot at 1 in the morning, and I'm not going to say no just to prove I don't need it," she said finally. She opened the door, then paused, half in, half out, and something almost like a dare crossed her face. "Tuesday evenings, Maple Ridge. If you want to know whether it was really me in that room with your father, come find out yourself. Don't send someone to ask. Come." She got in and pulled out of the lot before he could answer, taillights shrinking down Reynolds Road the way they had the first night, except this time Emmett didn't stand there watching them disappear. He was already moving toward his own car, with a decision half-formed and hardening fast. He sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, phone in his hand, staring at a contact he hadn't called in 4 years. Not his assistant, who he'd used 2 nights ago to track down a work address, but the facility director herself, a woman who knew exactly who signed his checks and had never once had the nerve, or the reason, to ask why the biggest donor on her books had never walked through her front door. His thumb hovered over her name. 4 years of side doors, of nurses who let him in after hours so no one would recognize a Threadgill grieving in public. He'd told himself that was privacy. Standing in a Target parking lot twice now, listening to a woman describe his father with more tenderness than Emmett had allowed himself to feel in years, he understood privacy had never been the real reason. The real reason had a name, and it wasn't one he liked saying out loud even to himself. He called. The director picked up on the second ring, her voice carrying the specific alertness of someone answering a number they don't recognize this late. Emmett didn't waste the moment on pleasantries. He asked for the visitor log from 4 winters ago, February specifically, and the volunteer roster for the same window, and when she started to ask why, he told her the truth he'd kept from everyone at that company for 4 years. His father had died in that building, and he needed to know exactly who had been in the room. She went quiet on the other end. The kind of quiet that meant she was recalculating everything she thought she knew about the man funding half her budget. "Give me 2 days, she said finally. "Thursday. Front desk. I'll have it ready." The front desk, Emmett repeated, like the words needed testing before he could trust them. That's usually how people come in. she said, not unkindly, and hung up before he could explain that for him, that had never been true. He sat in the dark a long moment after the call ended, phone still warm against his palm, and let himself imagine, for the first time since his father died, walking through Maple Ridge's front entrance in daylight, signing his own name on a line meant for people who weren't afraid to be seen. Thursday evening, the front desk at Maple Ridge Hospice smelled like coffee and hand sanitizer, and Emmett stood in front of the sign-in binder longer than the act should have required, pen in hand, staring at a blank line like it might refuse him. A television murmured somewhere down the hall, low volume, tuned to nothing anyone was watching. Somewhere past the double doors, a call bell chimed twice and went quiet. He signed his name in full. Emmett R. Threadgill. No initials, no shorthand. The same signature that sat on 9-figure contracts, written now in a lobby he'd spent 4 years avoiding in daylight. Mr. Threadgill. The facility director came around the desk herself, a manila folder already in hand, her voice careful in the way people get careful around men who fund their budgets. I pulled everything from that February. Visitor log, staff schedule, volunteer roster. She hesitated. I have to say, we didn't know your father was. We would have reached out, offered. I made sure you couldn't. Emmett opened the folder before she could finish the sentence for him. That's not on you. The visitor log from 4 winters back showed almost nothing under his father's room number. No family, no friends. Just a handful of late-night entries logged by staff instead of guests, because the guest himself had refused to sign his own name. Emmett's jaw tightened at the sight of it, at the specific shape of his own cowardice, laid out in someone else's handwriting. He turned to the volunteer roster instead, and there it was, plain as anything. No longer a guess he was carrying around in his chest. Corrine Applewhite, Tuesday evenings. Wing C, February through March, 4 years ago. His father's wing, his father's exact window. She was there, Emmett said, mostly to himself. She still is, the director said. 11 years running. One of the best we've ever had. She studied him a moment longer than the folder required. Whatever brought you here today, Mr. Threadgill, I hope you find what you're looking for. If you've ever needed proof that the thing you feared saying out loud was actually true, subscribe now, because he just found his. And what he does with it is about to matter more than anything else in this story. He left with the folder pressed flat against his chest, like something that might slip if he loosened his grip, dialing before he'd cleared the parking lot, already thinking about the vantage tower, and a stairwell 3 miles away he had no reason yet to fear. Corrine didn't feel the floor tilt so much as she felt the wall arrive to meet her, faster than a wall should move, the fluorescent lights on floor 9 smearing sideways for 1 long second before a hand closed around her arm. Whoa! Hey! I got you! Denise from the 7th floor crew had her by the elbow, cart abandoned, voice pitched high with the specific fear of someone who'd just watched a coworker's knees buckle without warning. Corrine, look at me. I'm fine. The words came out thinner than she meant them to, her own voice sounding far away in her ears. Low blood sugar. Long shift. You're gray. Sit down before you make me carry you. Denise lowered her onto an overturned bucket in the stairwell, radio already in hand, and Corrine let her, because the alternative was proving a point on a concrete floor. Emmett arrived at the loading bay 9 minutes later, folder still under his arm, and found Corrine sitting upright on a bucket in the stairwell doorway with a bottle of orange juice in her hand, and Denise crouched beside her, both of them looking up at him like he'd walked into something that wasn't his to walk into. I'm fine, Corrine said again, before he could ask, sharper this time, aimed as much at herself as at him. Denise took the cue and stepped back toward the elevator, muttering something about finishing floor 7, leaving the two of them alone in a stairwell that still felt too quiet after all that noise. Emmett didn't say anything about the folder, or February, or the 4 years he'd just spent confirming in a lobby 3 miles away. He just stood there, watching her hands shake, something he'd never seen from her before. The steadiness finally cracked open by something her own body had done without asking permission. Corrine looked up at him from the bucket, orange juice forgotten in her hand, and asked the question she'd clearly been holding back since the register. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Emmett sat down on the concrete beside the bucket, close enough to answer, careful not to crowd her while he did it. "My father died at Maple Ridge 4 winters ago. Wing C, February." He watched her go very still. "I never signed the visitor log. I used a side door. A nurse let me through after hours, because I couldn't stand the idea of anyone seeing a Threadgill grieving in public, like grief was a stock price that needed managing." He pulled the folder from under his arm, didn't open it, just held it like proof he no longer needed to hide behind. "I found your name on the volunteer roster tonight. Tuesday evenings. Wing C. The same window." Corrine's hand tightened around the orange juice bottle. "You're saying I sat with him. I think you did. You described a man who wouldn't let anyone fix his blanket without an argument. And that was my father down to the letter. And I have spent 4 years so afraid of what people would do with my grief, that I let a stranger carry it instead of me." His voice broke on the last word, the first crack Corrine had heard in it since the register. "That's why this matters. Not because you remind me of him, because you might be the only person alive who knows how he really was at the end. And I was too much of a coward to find out myself. If you've ever needed someone to finally tell you the truth, instead of managing you, subscribe now. Because this is the moment 2 people stop performing for each other and start actually seeing one another." Something in Corrine's face gave way. Not collapse, just the particular release of a woman, setting down a weight she hadn't realized she was still holding alone. "I wasn't rescued tonight," she said, quiet. "I want that understood before we go any further. Whatever help you're offering, I pay what I can toward it, on a schedule we agree on together. I'm not becoming somebody's charity case at 61 years old." "Agreed," Emmett said, and meant it enough to already be reworking the terms in his head. Corrine pulled her phone from her jacket pocket, hands steadier now than they'd been in the loading bay, and dialed a number she'd apparently been avoiding for months. "Hey, baby," she said when her daughter picked up, and Emmett stood and stepped back toward the stairwell door to give her the room the conversation needed. He still caught pieces of it. "I should have told you in March." "No. Listen to me. I'm okay right now. I'm sitting down. I'm okay. Kidneys, stage 4. I didn't want you carrying it." And then a long silence on Corrine's end that told him her daughter was finally saying everything she'd been holding back too. When the call ended, Corrine sat with the phone in her lap for a moment before looking up at him. Something loosened in her whole posture that hadn't been there an hour ago. "She's driving up tonight," Corrine said. Didn't even let me finish my sentence. "Good," Emmett said, and something in his chest loosened that had been locked tight for 4 years. Corrine studied him for a long moment, like she was deciding whether the rest of it was hers to give him yet. "There's one more thing," she said finally, "that I haven't said out loud to anybody, not even my daughter." She set the empty bottle down beside her on the concrete. "Your father's name was Silas. I know that, because in his last coherent week, he made me promise him something, and I've kept that promise every Tuesday since, without ever once knowing it would find its way back to his own son, standing in a stairwell 4 years later." "What did he ask you?" Corrine looked at him, and for the first time all night, she let the silence stretch on purpose. "He made me promise him the next hard case at Maple Ridge would get someone who actually showed up," Corrine said. "Not from a side door. Not late, after visiting hours, so nobody had to see them struggling. From the front, in daylight, where anyone could watch and it wouldn't matter." She looked at Emmett steady, the way she'd looked at him since the register, except softer now, worn down to something honest. "I've kept that promise every Tuesday for 4 years, without knowing whose son I was keeping it for." Emmett sat with that a long moment, the folder still in his lap, the visitor log inside it, finally meaning something other than shame. "You already kept it," he said. "Tonight. You just didn't know it yet." 6 weeks later, the porch light at Karina's house in West Toledo stayed on past dark most Sundays. Because her daughter drove up with the grandbabies now, instead of calling to check in from Sylvania. Corinne's numbers were stable, her treatment running on a schedule she'd negotiated herself, paid down the way she'd insisted. A portion from her, a portion from Emmett's clinics. Nothing handed to her she hadn't agreed to first. She still worked reduced hours at the Vantage Tower, by choice, and she still showed up at Maple Ridge on Tuesday evenings with a bag of yarn, because some promises didn't stop just because the reason for keeping them had finally introduced himself. Emmett found her on the porch that Sunday, with a shawl folded in his hands, gray, hand-knitted, the cable pattern crooked in places where his fingers had clearly fought the yarn and lost more than once. "You made this?" "6 attempts. This was the best one." He held it out. "You taught me the stitch 3 weeks ago and told me I was hopeless. I wanted proof you were wrong." Corinne took it, turned it over, found the uneven tension in the cables and the one dropped stitch he'd clearly tried to hide near the hem, and something in her face opened all the way, wide and unguarded, the way it hadn't been since a Target checkout line had cracked both of their lives open. "You're still hopeless," she said, and wrapped it around her shoulders anyway. "But it's warm." If a story like this reminded you that showing up matters more than showing off, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Her grandson ran past them, chasing a ball across the yard, and her daughter called something from the kitchen window about dinner being ready, and Emmett stood on a porch that had nothing to do with hospitals or grief or side doors. Just a Sunday, ordinary and whole. The following Tuesday, Emmett drove Corinne to Maple Ridge himself, and for the first time in his life he walked through the front entrance, instead of circling around to the side, past the front desk where a new volunteer coordinator glanced up and simply said, "Good evening," past the sign-in binder, where he wrote his name without hesitating over a single letter. Corinne signed hers beside his, same as she had 11 years running, and together they walked down the hallway toward Wing C, where a new resident who'd been dreading Tuesday evening was about to meet a woman who never once forgot to show up.